Hello and welcome. You're watching the weekly Meet TV show. I'm Tafaragadamu. The climate summit in Copenhagen has come to an end, but the arguments and counter-arguments continue. What did Africa get out of that summit, or out of that deal, if there is at all any? My guest today, the Director General of the Ethiopian Environmental Protection Authority, Dr. TEWOLDEBERHAN GEBRE EGZIABHER, will be shedding some light on those deals. A very warm welcome to the show, Professor.
Thank you for having me on this show.
There are, as I've said in my intro, there are arguments and counter-arguments. It depends on where you find yourself in regards to the deal that has come out of the Copenhagen summit. Did we achieve anything? Or nothing, as your detractors would argue?
Of course, when any attempt is made to achieve something, the end result is always debated, and that is a healthy thing, because it is when we feel things could improve that we go on improving. Did we get anything from the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties? Yes, we did. Did we get all that we had wanted to get? No, we didn't.
Why didn't you get that? I mean, initially the Prime Minister told in a couple of three press conferences and public appearances, Prime Minister Meles Zenawi said that he was shooting for a couple $100+ billion in compensation for various projects in the global south, particularly Africa. But he ended up grabbing the $10 billion. For example, let's start with that. It's a phenomenal decrease in terms of the figures, in terms of dollars for mitigation and adaptation, primarily caused by environmental change in the country.
Well, money wasn't the intention. Money is a means to achieving something. What was the intention that was to be achieved? The intention was to stop climate change. And how do we stop climate change? By reducing the greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, reducing them to levels that equilibrate so that the rise in temperature stops.
What is that level? Was it the 2 degrees Celsius maximum, as was agreed? I mean, in the deal.
Yes, and that's bad. Of course, ideally we don't want any change.
And it's actually even much worse, because your detractors say that's 3.5 for Africa.
Well, let me finish though. Ideally, we want no change in temperature, but it has already happened. And it happened before humanity realized that it was happening. We are faced with a situation. What we can now do as humanity is, first, stop the situation continuing, changing in the direction that it has been changing, and then eventually reverse the process so that global warming is eliminated eventually. Now, how can that be done? That could be done if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases immediately. Obviously, that is not possible.
But you can limit them, and that's the question.
Pardon?
But you can limit them.
That is it. And how you can limit it is where the argument comes. And if you would let me continue a little bit, I would show you what I mean. If you cannot stop it, what you can aim is, as you rightly said, limit it. And to be able to limit it, you have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you have to modify your path of development. Existing machinery that functions with fossil fuels has to be discarded, and you have to replace it by machinery that uses renewable energy, and that cannot be done overnight. Those who are likely to suffer major drastic outcomes, like, say, the Maldives, which is going to disappear as a state, as a country, would want everything to stop immediately. Those who are now freezing in the snow that has fallen in Europe and North America want their heating system to continue. And you have a direct clash. There is no possibility for an immediate agreement to stop generating greenhouse gases. The machinery that has existed, the systems of energy production and use that had existed have to continue, and countries have to be willing to invest time, energy, money, human resources into shifting. And that takes both time and patience. And yet those who are about to perish cannot be expected to have the patience.
Exactly.
And hence, a clash is inevitable.
But there was a great deal of arm twisting from the side of the Western powers, who are the greatest polluters, the largest polluters in this continent. Is it not true?
They are the biggest polluters, yes. And they are the ones that should lead the world in shifting our path of development into using energy that is renewable. And
but until that's achieved, until that is achieved, a shift to renewable energy, something has to be done. And it's the detractors, I mean, your critics, their argument is this: it's the West imposing, dictating on Africa, and Africa has lost. Actually, chief negotiators from the African continent have succumbed to it.
No, I don't agree with you. I don't agree with you. The industrialized countries are also working hard to shift their path of development, and they have agreed to help the rest of the world, the developing world, also to develop in a sustainable manner without polluting the atmosphere. We would want the pollution to stop immediately. We cannot stop it immediately. That's what I want to say. Therefore, we argue as to when we can stop it. And the argument continues, but the world is united. I have not heard any delegation that has insisted that we do not need to change. The whole world is agreed now that we must change. It is our wishes diverse, and our wishes depend on the specificities in our respective countries on the one hand, and yet they are also determined by the specificities in other countries, for the very simple reason that the climate does not know the difference between pollution coming from one country and another.
But
the climate is the same for all.
Exactly, I absolutely agree. But coming back to my point, to the point that I raised earlier, for example, there is the African Civil Society Organization, or members of the African civil societies, particularly in the person of Lumumba, have argued their case, and they have caught so much media attention. They say this is something that's imposed on Africa, and that this is an agreement that would give a a free way to the Western world. It's basically a suicide that Africans have agreed to the terms dictated by the West. I mean, doesn't that make sense?
Let me correct you. Lumumba is not from the civil society.
But
he's a delegate of the Sudan.
But, yeah, but
secondly,
the G7, the G77 bloc, he was one of the chief negotiators for that.
That's not civil society, that is governments.
Right.
And so it is not civil society.
But the civil society also argues the same way. Oxfam has organized a hearing of some sort, and they said this is
I'm not going to be able to continue this conversation because you're not even letting me finish one bloody sentence.
Okay.
You're having me sit here to finish your lecturing. Go ahead, finish. Or let me finish my statements also.
Please.
All right.
Like that.
With that agreement, I can start talking. What I am telling you is, given these major differences in the world, it is to be expected that there will be major clashes. One. Secondly, given these major differences in the world, the civil society voices are going to be very diverse. There were civil society representatives in Copenhagen that were trying to preach to us that this is all lies, climate is not changing, man has nothing to do with it. And some are saying, oh, the governments are all together condemning us to death. This is a Holocaust. They're entitled to their own opinions. Governments negotiate to come to as sensible an agreement as they can. And the sensible agreement that they arrive at obviously will depend, one, on how effectively they put their arguments, and two, on how realistic their expectations are. Wishful thinking is one thing. Realism is what must prevail.
So you were pragmatic, is that what you're saying?
Yes, you have to be pragmatic. You have to be pragmatic. There is no way. We are in this situation together. We can only get out of it if we are pragmatic and willing to evaluate the problems of one another. And the problems of one another means those of us in developing countries also appreciating the problems of the industrialized countries. Just as those in the industrialized countries have to appreciate our problems. Fortunately, I think we do. The world is at least united in trying to solve this major problem.
But why is there no binding agreement signed? I mean, there is no treaty, there is no binding legal instrument. We have simply an understanding. If the world has come together to understand the problem...
Well, if you ask me that specific question, I can give you the technical reasons of why. Negotiations take a long time. Even such a simple thing as my son wanting to marry your daughter, and I send smugglers or older people to your house, and we debate what arrangements should be made. That takes time, let alone such a huge global thing. And the negotiations started only 2 years ago. They've been making progress. The expectation was that the negotiations will finish in 2 years. They didn't. That does not mean that the world does not want a binding agreement at the end.
But we had Kyoto before this one, and there's so many years in between.
Can you repeat your question?
There was a Kyoto agreement,
Yes.
and between Kyoto and now Copenhagen, there were so many years in between. So it looks like that we are walking very
No.
slowly.
The present negotiations that were meant to be finalized in Copenhagen started in Bali 2 years ago.
I mean, the whole discourse on climate, where nations came together to sort out a means to address those which were not signed by other influential countries
Then
too.
please let me explain the whole process. In 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was agreed. By its nature, a framework convention means specific detail has to be worked out in the future. One of the specific details that was worked out was the Kyoto Protocol. It came into force 3 years ago. It has 2 more years to go before the present phase ends. And 2 years ago, that is 1 year after the Kyoto Protocol came into force, the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change agreed in Bali on the Bali Roadmap or Bali Plan of Action. And that plan of action had 2 tracks of negotiations. One was to continue with the Kyoto Protocol so that there will be new commitments to reduce emissions in the industrialized countries, minus the United States of America. I say minus because the United States of America is not a party to the Kyoto Protocol. And then that will come into force, the new set of commitments will come into force at the end of 2012. The other track was under the convention, as I told you, the Framework Convention envisages various specificities emerging in due time. And the specificities that were to emerge were, one, how do you deal with countries like the United States of America, which has refused to become a party to the Kyoto Protocol? How do you deal with countries like Ethiopia who can contribute towards halting the change in climate, but are not obliged to, because they are not responsible for the change in climate. Nevertheless, we have to use all human resources available because it is a calamity that affects all of us. And thus, the Bali Plan of Action was designed to end up in a negotiated agreement which would have been finalized in Copenhagen to deal with all the other questions, other than that under the Kyoto Protocol. What has happened is neither the negotiations under the Kyoto Protocol nor the other sets of negotiations got finalized. And that is because of the difficulties I described. Then the difficulties are real. But all countries are saying they want to go on negotiating, and there will be a next negotiation session in June in Bonn. And hopefully, within 1 year, the negotiations will be finalized so that the next conference of the parties, which will take place in Mexico City,
in 2010,
will finalize what could not be finalized in Copenhagen.
What do you expect in 6 months, for example?
Pardon?
What do you expect to happen in 6 months?
What do I
with regard
expect?
to this negotiations?
I expect, one, the commitments by the parties to the Kyoto Protocol to have been made and to be approved in Mexico City.
Mm-hmm.
2, I expect the various negotiations in groups, in various groups. It would take us a long time to describe the various groups.
Right, exactly. I'm talking about the key ones, yeah.
And the framework convention also to be finalized, and to come up with a legally binding agreement. What kind of legally binding agreement would come out of that? One will have to wait and see. Will it be another protocol? Will there be a syncing of the Kyoto Protocol together with a new agreement, and we'll have a new protocol? Will it be several other protocols? All this is open, and the negotiations will determine what final form the legal agreements will take place. But an understanding has come out of Copenhagen. The major variables have been decided upon. The major variables that were decided upon in Copenhagen are the following. 1, until 2015, all countries will act so that the temperature rise does not go above 2 degrees centigrade. By 2015, an evaluation of both the current scientific knowledge and the current commitments in both mitigation and adaptation will be reviewed, so that the increase in temperature will go down to a maximum of 1.5 degrees, and eventually then eliminate the increase altogether. And we will have to go on negotiating.
Right. So
in the meantime, to do that, financial commitments, technological commitments, and capacity building commitments had to be made, and they have been made.
The pledges. They have been pledged already, so we'll be able to get.
Yeah, decisions has been taken. The 115 heads of government that were in Copenhagen have been told by themselves that money will start flowing in 2010, which is coming January, at the rate of 10 billion a year for adaptation and mitigation in developing countries, and this will go on for 3 years until 2012. In 2012, the money will start increasing so that it reaches 50 billion a year by 2015. And then it will continue rising so that it will reach $100 billion a year in 2020. This is the minimum.
But how prepared will be like countries in Africa prepared are they to utilize the monies that would come in terms of for adaptation and mitigation purposes, as you've said?
The preparedness in Africa varies. Some are better prepared than others, but certainly the commitment for capacity building and for technology transfer is to help them get prepared and to help them get effective. They will be. In the final analysis, though, it will depend on the initiative within each country in Africa as to how effective a country can become. I can tell you how effective Ethiopia can become, because I am an Ethiopian and in Ethiopia. The basis for both adaptation and mitigation is mass action, grassroots action. And the Ethiopian governance system works from bottom up. And therefore, that is why we already have got the vegetation cover recovering very fast. How Ethiopia, with a population of only around 80 million, has been only second to China with a population of 1.3 billion in planting trees in the last 2 years, and will continue to do that. So this is both in terms of mitigation and adaptation, an indication of what Ethiopia can do. Ethiopia will have to do more homework to specify details of both adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation in what? Adaptation in agricultural research so that our agriculture keeps being productive in the changing climate. Our healthcare system becomes effective so that the multiplying health hazards are prevented from causing serious damage. Our crop, animal, and plant protection systems become effective enough so that plant, animal, and crop diseases and pests that are bound to grow with the climate change are controlled. And this is nothing new. Ethiopia has been doing these things already, and I expect, therefore, an intensification is all that is needed in what Ethiopia has been doing to have a very effective adaptation program. The very adaptation program is going to end up as doing the mitigation that is required, because the only mitigation Ethiopia can do, virtually no greenhouse gases, is in improving its forestry cover so that we can sequester carbon, in helping improve its agricultural system so that the agriculture of the country can also sequester carbon. And these are already processes that have been started. Are other African countries in a similar state of preparedness as Ethiopia? Some are, some are not. Unfortunately, some cannot be. For example, I can't expect Somalia to be effective on an immediate basis. But I can expect many other African countries to be as effective.
Dr. Tewolde, thank you very much for coming to share your views. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.